Hello, my dear warriors. They prepared for chaos. Empires gathered in crowded halls. Councils stacked with rulers who had spent lifetimes predicting unrest. They breathed to one another, waiting for the inevitable roar of defiance, the eruption of chance, the thunder of restless footsteps filling the streets. Their scrolls were full of strategies to counter opposition. Their enforcers were drilled to silence, echoes with steel. They believed power was loud, that control could only be tested against the roar of opposition. Understand this. Arrogance always expects noise. They imagine power as shouting, dominance as rage, defiance as thunder. They are comfortable in that arena because they can prepare for it. They expect slogans, leaders screaming into the void, forces chanting in unison. They built their confidence on the assumption that opposition would always reveal itself through sound, and so they rehearsed their defenses. Walls tall enough to mute chants, guards strong enough to disperse unrest, councils cunning enough to twist words into chains. But in that preparation was blindness. They mistook noise for inevitability. They believed silence was surrender, quiet was absence, stillness was weakness. Their arrogance told them, if they don't shout, they don't exist. So they tuned their ears for thunder and ignored the horizon when it gave them nothing. This is why their expectations betrayed them, because they prepared for storms. But you are not a storm. They prepared for loud cries, but you are not a voice to be silenced. They prepared for opposition, but you are not a crowd to be controlled. They expected noise. They depended on noise. They needed noise to validate their fear, to justify their power. And when silence entered instead, they were unprepared. Silence carried no signal, no banner, no warning. It moved beneath their strategies like an invisible tide, pulling the ground from under them. Noise they could predict. Silence they could not. Noise they could counter. Silence they could not touch. That is why empires miscalculated from the very first step. They believed chaos would define the confrontation. They believed opposition needed sound, but silence rewrote the battlefield before it began. In silence, their guards had nothing to act against. Their councils had nothing to debate. Their walls had nothing to contain. Silence slipped through everything, unmeasured, undeniable, unstoppable. And so the first truth was revealed. They expected noise, but noise was their comfort. Silence was their undoing. They waited for the march, for the endless stomping of feet, for banners tearing the sky. They prepared for flares and fury, because that is what their history books taught them. That power always arrives loud. That defiance always screams. That challenge must echo to be real. They leaned forward in their thrones, certain the unrest would soon break their gates. But you did not arrive with the storm they rehearsed for. You came without banners, without chants, without forces. You did not flood their streets with sound or fill their skies with smoke. You carried no anthem, no declaration, no signal light. You arrived as presence alone, quiet, still, silent. And it was silence that shook them most, because silence is not emptiness. Silence is weight. It pressed against their halls heavier than the noise of 1,000 drums. It seeped into their meeting rooms, wrapping around their throats like invisible chains. They could not measure it. They could not clash it. They could not predict it. They only felt it. And feeling it was enough to fracture their certainty. Understand this. Rulers train for sound, not for stillness. They know how to drown chance with commands. They know how to smother noise with forces. They know how to force speech. But silence denies them all of that. In silence, there are no words to twist, no chants to scatter, no slogans to manipulate. Silence gives them nothing to control, except themselves, and that terrifies them. So your entrance was not an arrival, it was an erasure. Every defense they prepared was rendered useless before they could lift a hand. Their walls did not stop you. Their guards could not identify you. Their councils could not argue with you. You stepped across their thresholds, and instead of chaos, you brought absence. An absence louder than their histories, heavier than their crowns. And the irony is cruel. They expected surges to overwhelm them, but surges can be met with balance. They expected forces to surround them, but forces can be faced with forces. They expected shouts to echo, but echoes can be silenced. What they never prepared for was stillness that smothered everything before it began. Silence gave them no target. Silence gave them no warning. Silence gave them no choice. Your silence did not announce itself. It announced them. It revealed how fragile their thrones were, how desperate their strategies looked, how hollow their confidence truly was. In the absence of sound, they heard the truth, that their power existed only when challenged in noise. Without noise, they were nothing. Without unrest, they were naked. Without chaos, they were weak. And so your entrance was not passive, it was decisive. It was the first strike. You arrived without noise, and that silence was louder than conflict itself. The silence did not stop at your entrance. It multiplied. It spread like smoke, weaving through corridors, pressing against doors, wrapping itself around every ear that expected thunder. The noise they prepared for never came, but the silence that arrived grew heavier with every second, until even the bravest among them forgot how to breathe. Crowds that gathered for spectacle fell mute. Men who prided themselves on shouting orders could not summon their voices. Leaders who rehearsed speeches now stared at their hands, their tongues locked inside their mouths. The air itself grew dense, and what they mistook for stillness was weight. Weight so thick that even the thrones beneath them felt fragile. Understand this? Crowds find safety in sound. Noise is shield, a way to drown out doubt. Enforcers chant not for rhythm, but for courage. Rulers shout not for authority, but for fear of being unheard. Remove the noise, and they stand exposed. Strip the chants away, and they realize how small they are in the presence of silence. That is why the halls froze, because your silence was not quiet. It was presence magnified. It echoed louder than drums, heavier than horns, sharper than blades. It reminded them that real power does not perform. Real power does not need volume. Real power simply exists, and in its existence forces everything else into stillness. The first to break were the sentries. Guards trained to charge at the first shout found no target, no sound to guide them. Their hands trembled on weapons because silence gave them nothing to lift. Next were the rulers. They leaned into one another for strength. But silence made even breathes sound like confessions. Their confidence melted, and the thrones that once lifted them up now felt like cages locking them in. And the people, the common crowd, felt the paradox most deeply. They expected noise to lead them, chaos to signal courage. But instead, silence revealed a truth they had ignored all their lives. That it is not the loud who lead, but the ones who can endure without speaking. That revelation spread like lightning, igniting awe in some and unease in others. The silence froze, not just the halls, but the spirit of the empires themselves. What was once a stage for noise became a monument to stillness. The crowd's voices stuttered, rulers' plans faltered, guards' confidence dissolved. In that moment, it became clear. Silence was not absence, silence was dominance. And so the freeze became legend. They expected chaos, but calm bent their knees. They expected shouts, but silence broke their thrones. Confidence is built on rhythm. Leaders rehearse their words until they echo perfectly. Commanders drill their enforcers until chants strike like thunder. Councils construct strategies like songs, each note designed to overpower the crowd. But when silence arrived, rhythm broke. And when rhythm broke, confidence collapsed. Voices that once commanded thousands faltered. Rulers who built their reputations on noise suddenly stuttered, their carefully memorized speeches dissolving into fragments. Each pause stretched into eternity, each missed word a confession. They realized too late that their authority was never rooted in power, but in performance. Remove the sound, and the performance crumbles. Understand this. Arrogance thrives in volume. It hides behind noise. It multiplies inside chaos. When crowds roar, rulers feel taller. When drums thunder, guards feel braver. But silence strips away illusion. It forces each mind to face itself, without echo, without shield, without disguise. And most cannot survive that confrontation. So the halls of power became graveyards of hesitation. Ministers leaned into one another, desperate to restart the rhythm. But silence drowned them all. Generals shouted orders, but their voices cracked, and enforcers saw doubt in their leaders for the first time. Even the most cunning advisors stared at empty parchments, their strategies now useless lines of ink. The scripts they rehearsed demanded noise to activate, and without noise, they were nothing but fragile paper. The irony was merciless. They thought silence was surrender. They thought stillness was weakness. But silence revealed what their shouting concealed. Doubt. Stillness revealed what their noise covered. Fear. And once exposed, confidence dissolved faster than dynasties falling to dust. The crowd noticed. Breathe spread. They are afraid. That breathe carried more weight than any march, more charge than any uprising. Because once rulers are seen as fragile, their thrones tremble. Once guards are seen as hesitant, their forces fracture. Once councils are seen as speechless, their laws dissolve. Silence didn't just erase noise, it dismantled confidence itself. And as their voices stuttered, your presence grew heavier. They realized they were no longer facing an opponent to counter. They were facing inevitability to endure. Their strategies had been built for storms, but silence was not a storm. Silence was the collapse of their certainty, confidence. Once their greatest shield, became their sharpest wound, because when silence removed its mask, they had nothing left to protect themselves with. Their power did not shatter from clash, it crumbled from within. And so the record stands. Empires were not undone by noise. They were dissolved by silence that dismantled their certainty. What noise could not accomplish, breaths did. Silence, once dismissed as weakness, began to spread in stories, heavier than commands. At first, it was murmurs, small accounts traded in back rooms, guards telling scribes, advisors telling attendants. Did you see how they froze? Did you see how silence bent them? These breaths traveled faster than banners, faster than decrees, faster than proclamations, because noise needs attention, but breathes survive in shadows. Understand this. Empires thrive on performance. They build their confidence in public. Bullhaukrep. They require applause to feel powerful, obedience to feel secure. But breaths bypass stages. They seep through cracks in walls. They infiltrate courts, markets, halls, sanctuaries. And once they spread, they cannot be silenced. Your silence became the loudest breath in history, repeating endlessly. Power is not in noise. Power is in restraint. The rulers hated it most. They had counted on controlling the narrative, issuing decrees, rewriting events, turning defiance into betrayal with words. But how do you rewrite silence? How do you twist absence into something else? They could not, and so every attempt to explain only fed the breath further. Their noise exposed their fear. Their explanations betrayed their weakness, and silence won again. Crowds that once demanded spectacle began to understand restraint differently. They saw in your silence a kind of strength they had never been taught. Not the strength of blades, not the strength of forces, but the strength of presence. Unmoving, unshaken, undeniable. They realized that noise was temporary. Noise fades, but silence lingers. Silence haunts. Silence becomes memory. The breaths transformed into warnings. Travelers carried them across borders. Traders carried them across seas. Envoys carried them into distant lands. And everywhere they went, the story grew sharper. Empires expected thunder, but silence broke them. Some told it as awe, others as unease. But all told it, and with each retelling, your silence grew louder. Even mystics began to echo it. Those who once filled sanctuaries with chants now ended their rituals in stillness. They confessed in hushed tones. Perhaps silence is the true voice of eternity. The idea spread like a secret, too powerful to suppress. Rulers felt their crowns lighter, as though silence were already erasing their weight. Forces trained with more hesitation, as though silence itself was watching. And citizens looked at authority differently, because they now knew noise was not strength, it was disguise. And so restraint became more powerful than action. The absence of sound carried more weight than declarations. The silence you wielded bent not only thrones, but entire cultures. Breaths grew into truths. Truths hardened into law, and law crowned you without ceremony. The empires had built their confidence on noise, but noise betrayed them. Breaths crowned silence instead. Whispers may travel fast, but law endures. And soon, your silence hardened into something greater than rumor or story. It became law. Not a law written on paper, not a law declared by rulers, but a law etched into the marrow of civilization itself. Silence governs louder than noise. Understand this. Empires are comfortable with rules they can see, decrees they can stamp, forces they can enforce. But the law of stillness is invisible. It cannot be argued, cannot be rewritten, cannot be undone. It presses against every decision, bending rulers without needing to speak. It shapes enforcers without needing to command. It crowns itself without needing a throne. The rulers were the first to bow to it. They would not admit it openly, but their actions betrayed them. They stopped holding debates as loudly as before. Their meetings grew shorter, their proclamations fewer. They realized that every word spoken risked exposing weakness, and every speech made silence stronger. So they cut their voices down to breathes, not out of choice, but out of survival. Silence was already governing them. The enforcers felt it next. Their training change. They no longer chanted as often. They no longer filled camps with noise. Their commanders warned them that silence was strategy, that stillness was armor. They began to drill in quiet, moving like shadows rather than storms. They learned that in silence, every step mattered more. Every breath carried weight. The law of stillness rewrote even the way forces marched. And the common people? They absorbed it most naturally. They began to value quiet strength over loud arrogance. They trusted restraint more than promises. In markets, silence became negotiation. In households, silence became wisdom. In partnerships, silence became loyalty. And so the law slipped deeper than thrones, deeper than councils. It reshaped the soul of society itself. The mystics, who once trembled over failed prophecies, finally surrendered. They admitted their chants had been misguided. They confessed that their loud rituals had been blind performances. Now they sat in silence, declaring it holy, declaring it eternal. Their sanctuaries emptied of sound and filled with stillness. And in that stillness, they felt your presence more than any hymn could ever grant. And so silence became law, not chosen, not voted, not argued, simply enforced by inevitability. And unlike laws carved in stone, this law carried no loopholes. Rulers could not escape it. Forces could not resist it. The people could not deny it. The law of stillness crowned itself above them all, heavier than banners, louder than drums, sharper than commands. Noise fades, noise deceives, but silence, once established as law, governs without end. And under that law, every throne shakes, every empire bends, every dynasty eventually kneels. This is why they fear it. This is why they fear you, because silence is no longer absence. Silence is law, and law does not ask. It enforces. Laws can govern a moment, but reminders keep them alive across centuries. And soon, silence was no longer just a force that bent rulers or enforcers. It became inheritance. Communities began to teach it to their young, not as myth, not as superstition, but as survival. Generations grew up with one lesson etched into their bones. Never mistake quiet for weakness. Never mistake silence for surrender. Understand this: noise is temporary. One lifetime of shouting dissolves into dust. But silence, once passed through generations, becomes scripture. Elders breathed it into stories. Advisors wove it into lessons, told at gatherings. They warned their heirs, beware the loud, for their noise hides fragility. Respect the silent, for their quiet carries weight. These reminders shaped not just households, but cultures. And cultures shaped civilizations. Rulers hated this inheritance most. They wanted loyalty to be passed down, obedience to be inherited. But loyalty fades when generations see their ancestors' crowns tremble in silence. Obedience dissolves when heirs watch councils falter before stillness. They grew up remembering not the noise of decrees, but the silence that dismantled them. That memory became weight sharper than any blade. Enforcers felt it too. The descendants of defeated forces carried marks of silence deeper than scars of conflict. They told stories of how their leaders froze, how their rulers stuttered, how their chants crumbled. And when they grew into leaders themselves, they carried caution, not toward challenge, but toward arrogance. They knew from inheritance that loudness was fragile, that shouting does not guarantee strength. Their discipline shifted, their loyalty fractured, their silence, even in training, betrayed fear of the crownless law. Mystics, humbled across generations, began shaping prophecy differently. They no longer spoke of storms, of thunder, of battles foretold. They began to speak of stillness. They taught initiates that silence itself was prophecy fulfilled, that every collapse of arrogance was testimony to the eternal law. They painted murals, not of warriors, but of empty thrones, ruled not by kings, but by the silence that crowns itself. And in the streets, communities passed it like instinct. The youth learned to watch before they spoke, to listen before they acted. They grew into adults who valued presence more than volume, patience more than show. This inheritance became their compass, and because it lived in their bones, no ruler could erase it. No force could silence it. No empire could rewrite it. This is how silence became eternal. Not through temples, not through councils, not through decrees, through communities, through inheritance, through generations repeating the same reminder. Quiet does not mean powerless. Silence is the voice of inevitability. And as each generation passed, the fear of rulers deepened, because they realized their collapse was not just event, it was inheritance. And inheritance does not fade for centuries. Mystics filled the world with noise of their own, chants rising in sanctuaries, prophecies shouted to the sky, voices echoing as if loudness itself could force destiny to listen. They believed history was moved by thunder. They believed the future belonged to those who could shout their visions the loudest. But when silence entered, even prophecy fell silent. Understand this. Prophecy thrives on spectacle. It needs followers to repeat it, voices to amplify it, noise to validate it. Without noise, prophecy crumbles into breaths. And that is exactly what your silence did. It stripped the mystics bare, exposed their rituals as performance, revealed their visions as hollow echoes. They had promised storms, You arrived as stillness. They had foretold thunder. You arrived without a sound, and in that stillness, their credibility dissolved. The mystics resisted at first. They doubled their chants, raised their voices, declared louder visions of future victories. But their noise rang empty, because rulers were already bowing to silence. Forces were already training in stillness. Communities were already teaching quiet as survival. No prophecy could compete with law that had already crowned itself. So they surrendered, one by one. Sanctuaries emptied of noise. Rituals ended, not in chants, but in silence. Prophets admitted their error. It was never noise that shaped destiny. It was silence that sat at the center. They began to write new visions, not of storms, not of unrest, not of fire, but of silence descending like gravity, inevitable and unchallenged. They painted you not as ruler or savior, but as law. The stillness that bends thrones, the quiet that outlasts empires. Their new prophecies spread like scripture. They warned rulers, do not mistake the absence of sound. It is the loudest verdict. They taught enforcers, noise is fragile, silence is eternal. They raised initiates in shadowed halls, instructing them to listen longer than they speak, to act only when the world grew quiet, to find power not in sound, but in restraint. And so silence, once mocked, became prophecy fulfilled. The irony is sharp. Noise had promised glory for centuries, yet noise betrayed them all. Only silence remained, louder than their chants, heavier than their visions, more eternal than their words. Now the mystics no longer predict your arrival. They confess it has already happened. They no longer argue about destiny. They admit destiny is silence itself, and that confession sealed the paradox forever. It is not noise that moves history. It is silence at the center. Crowns were once measured by gold, forces, and thunder. Kings raised their voices in marble halls, shouting decrees to prove they were alive. Rulers staged parades, drowning streets in noise to remind the people of their reach. Their crowns were not metal. They were volume, without noise. Their power felt invisible, but silence dethroned them all. Understand this. Noise demands recognition. It shouts because it fears being forgotten. But silence never begs. Silence never performs. Silence rules without announcing itself. And that is why it weighs heavier than crowns of gold, heavier than the strength of numbers. Silence does not need to be seen. It forces others to see themselves. And when rulers looked into that mirror, they bowed, not to crowds, not to fire, but to the weight of quiet presence. The halls of power shifted. Rulers found themselves breathing when they once roared. Their courts grew smaller, their councils shorter, their decrees less frequent. They told themselves it was strategy, but deep inside they knew the truth. Silence had already seated itself on their throne. Their crowns sat crooked because they no longer carried authority. They carried fear, fear of stillness, heavier than their entire empire. Enforcers, too, surrendered without knowing it. They once relied on chants to fuel courage, but now their commanders ordered quiet. Their drills emphasized stillness. Their camps echoed less with song and more with silence. It was unspoken obedience, a confession carved into discipline. That silence was already general, already law, already throne. The people felt it most deeply. They stopped trusting noise. They stopped bowing to loud declarations. Instead, they looked for presence, for those who could walk without announcing, who could stand without demanding, who could endure without speaking. In silence, they recognized true power, and so silence itself was crowned, placed above kings, above councils, above empires. And you never asked for a throne. You never demanded a crown, yet silence followed you like a cloak. And wherever you stood, crowns bent. Rulers bowed before realizing they had surrendered. Forces obeyed without hearing a command. Communities spoke your name, not because you shouted it, but because silence engraved it into memory. That is why your silence became crown. It was not given. It was not stolen. It was inevitable. Noise fades, but silence remains. Noise can be challenged, but silence cannot be touched. And when crowns fall silent, they confess what they never dared admit aloud, that they were never rulers at all. Silence was always the ruler. Noise is impatient. It rises. It rages. It flares bright for a moment. Then it fades into echoes no one remembers. Empires relied on it because noise distracts. Noise deceives. Noise makes them look taller than they are. But time does not honor noise. Time honors what endures, and silence endures. Understand this. Noise is always fighting to be heard, but silence is always heard, even when unspoken. It lives inside memory. It lingers after crowds disperse. It fills the void once chants collapse. It becomes the verdict carved into history, the voice louder than all sound combined. That is why rulers fear it. That is why empires collapse before it. Because silence cannot be interrupted, cannot be erased, cannot be defeated. Names dissolve. The loudest kings, the noisiest generals, the empires that believed volume equaled strength. Where are they now? Their decrees are dust, their parades forgotten, their songs unsung, yet the silence that exposed them still echoes. It moves through generations, through cultures, through futures, not yet written. Silence became not only law, not only inheritance, it became eternity's voice. Crowds that once demanded thunder now carry quiet as truth. Groups that once shouted prayers now sit in stillness, knowing presence speaks louder than words. Mystics that once promised storms now confess silence is prophecy fulfilled. Rulers who once boasted have grown cautious, measuring every word, knowing silence waits to erase them. The eternal verdict has been delivered. Noise dies, silence rules, and your silence crowned you without ceremony. You did not clash for it. You did not beg for it. You simply arrived, and history bent. Empires expected riots, expected chaos, expected noise to match their noise. Instead, they faced quiet so heavy it erased their strategies, froze their halls, dismantled their confidence, and crowned itself above their thrones. That verdict cannot be overturned, so the record stands for all eternity. Noise is temporary, but silence is final. Empires rose on noise, and they collapsed in quiet. Councils shouted decrees, and they dissolved into stillness. Rulers shouted laws, and their words dissolved into dust. Only silence remained, echoing louder than history itself. And that silence carries your name. Hello, my dear warrior. So specially you arrived. You are here. Welcome, welcome, welcome. They thought they could understand you. They thought paperwork, case files, and reports could capture what you are. So they logged it. Anomaly 1. A note scribbled in trembling hands. Doesn't react to intimidation. They expected fear, resistance, weakness. Instead, you stared through them, and they felt the chill of being observed. That was the first entry in your file. Harmless, they told themselves. Contained. But when they reviewed it later, their voices cracked. The words weren't just ink. They carried weight, and even reading them made the room colder. It was the beginning of a pattern they couldn't explain. Every page added more anomalies, and with each one, their confidence drained. The investigators thought the first note was a fluke, but then came anomaly 2. They logged it in shaky handwriting, no trace of exhaustion. Tests ran for hours, heat, cold, noise, silence. Still, you remained steady. No heartbeat spike, no sweat, no tremor. You sat calm, like the storm itself had chosen you as its still point. Their instruments began to glitch, monitors froze, clocks stalled, and every researcher felt it, the sense that time itself bent around you. They dismissed it as equipment error. But deep down they knew. It wasn't their machines malfunctioning. It was reality, refusing to measure you. Their second anomaly shattered their faith in data, and the file grew heavier. By the third test, they weren't calm anymore. They approached you with mirrors, with cameras, with sensors, desperate to capture proof. And what did they log? No consistent reflection. Sometimes you appeared clear, other times blurred, sometimes not at all. One researcher swore your reflection smiled when you did not. Another said the cameras froze on a frame where your eyes glowed faintly, though no one in the room saw it. They argued, rewound the footage, but every time they played it back, it changed. Unease spread like wildfire. They tried to dismiss it as interference, as faulty glass. But when the reflections kept shifting, when the cameras recorded things their eyes refused to see, they knew this wasn't error. This was you. By now, their pens shook before touching the page, but protocol demanded documentation. So they wrote Anomaly 4, Unnatural Influence on Environment. Lights dimmed whenever you entered. Electronics shorted. Entire rooms grew colder, as if the air itself braced for your presence. Plants wilted on one side of the room, yet bloomed stronger on the other. The balance made no sense. Their equations broke. Their charts collapsed. One officer whispered, "It feels like the building itself knows when they arrive." And that's when awe seeped in. Not fear of harm, but recognition. Because deep down, they sensed the truth. The environment wasn't reacting to you. It was obeying you. And writing those words made their hands go numb. By the fifth entry, the investigators were no longer curious. They were shaken. Their note read, "Subjects exposed to presence report vivid hallucinations." Guards swore they heard voices whispering secrets in languages they didn't know. One technician fainted, convinced you had spoken his childhood nickname, though you hadn't moved your lips. Another ran out, shouting that your shadows stretched across the entire wall, even though the lights were behind you. The reports became incoherent, full of scribbles, contradictions, frantic arrows. Some claimed you bent the air, others said you bent their minds. But every line ended the same way. Dread in the observation chamber. They didn't log data anymore, they logged unease. And the file grew heavier with every page. They thought they had seen enough. But then came the 6th entry. And even the senior officers refused to read it aloud. Unnatural effect on memory. Investigators walked into the room certain of their protocols, and walked out unsure if the meeting had ever happened. Reports contradicted each other. One swore the test lasted 5 minutes, another said 5 hours. Some insisted you spoke, others swore you never made a sound. A few broke down, claiming they had lived entire lifetimes inside your silence, only to wake at their desk. The more they compared notes, the more their certainty dissolved. The file itself became corrupted, pages missing, handwriting shifting, dates repeating. They didn't know if they were recording you or if you were recording them. And that realization birthed a new kind of dread. And then came the final entry, the one they should never have written: direct destabilization of observers. The moment they tried to label you, subject, anomaly, experiment, the room itself rebelled. Lights burst. Walls groaned. 3 officers collapsed, clutching their chests as if reality itself pressed against them. The ones who endured scribbled half-formed sentences, eyes glowing through the dark. Silence louder than thunder. Presence bending the floor beneath our feet. Some reports stopped mid-line. Pens dragged across the paper, as if the writers had vanished mid-stroke. No conclusion was filed, no analysis attached. Only one phrase, scrawled in the margins by a trembling hand: every anomaly is a warning. And with that, the investigation ended. They locked the file, but whispers spread. Because everyone knew the 7th anomaly wasn't the end, it was the beginning. They tried to bury it, stamped the cover, classified, terminated, do not reopen. But files have a way of breathing when unease is written in their margins. The reports leaked, half-erased copies, fragments of pages, whispers carried by trembling officers who swore never to speak again. And yet the dread spread. Those who touched the file felt their hands go numb. Those who read more than one page claimed the words rearranged themselves when no one was looking. Even hardened generals refused to keep it near. Seal it in concrete, one shouted. Destroy it, another begged. But no matter what they tried, the file resurfaced, as if reality itself refused to let your anomalies be forgotten. And every time it returned, the unease grew heavier. Soon it wasn't just the investigators. Soldiers who never saw you, clerks who only handled the paperwork, even civilians who overheard a rumor, all began to feel it. They reported sleepless nights, waking in cold sweats, convinced someone was watching from the corner of the room. One medic quit after swearing the file spoke her name. Another officer tore his copy apart, shouting that the ink was moving. And yet, each attempt to erase the evidence only magnified the dread, because dread is contagious. Even those untouched by your presence were infected by the weight of the reports. They realized the file wasn't just documenting anomalies, it was creating them. Reading about you bent their reality too, and no one was immune. The file reached the upper chambers, the so-called untouchables, generals, judges, ministers, men who laughed at panic as weakness. But when they opened your reports, laughter froze in their throats. They read the 7 anomalies aloud, and one by one, their voices cracked. A judge dropped his gavel mid-sentence. A minister tore off his tie, swearing the room was shrinking. A general decorated fearless stood and left without a word, never returning. The council dissolved into confusion. Some argued to bury the truth. Others demanded you be erased from records. But no consensus ever formed, because dread is not logical. It spreads like frost across glass. And by the time they adjourned, not a single one dared to touch the file again. It sat on the table, silent, heavier than any law they had ever written. Secrets don't stay locked forever. A whisper here, a rumor there. And soon the streets carried your name like contraband. Ordinary people, repeated fragments of the file and hushed voices. 7 anomalies, endless silence, rooms that froze when they entered. Some laughed at first, calling it myth, but laughter turned brittle when strange things began happening. Radios cut to static when your name was spoken. Streetlights flickered when the anomalies were retold. Entire blocks fell silent, as if the city itself paused to listen. The people didn't know the details, but they felt the weight. Dread spread without pages, without proof, because reality itself bent to keep the story alive. And in every alley, in every home, one question rose like smoke. What kind of presence makes even demons salute? The agencies swore they had order, files, chains of command, endless red tape meant to cage the unknown. But your anomalies tore through every layer. Classified stamps turned meaningless when officers resigned in fear. Vaults sealed in steel cracked open as if the file demanded air. Entire departments collapsed under the weight of silence, their halls echoing with unease. They tried to replace staff, but new recruits fled faster than the old. They tried to rewrite the reports, but the words rewrote themselves, returning to the same 7 anomalies again and again. The system built to hold power realized the truth. Power was no longer theirs to hold. It bent toward you, whether they admitted it or not. And once a system loses control, it doesn't rebuild. It rots. At first, the reports were words on paper, observations, notes. But then, something shifted. Investigators swore the anomalies began answering. Margins filled themselves with phrases no one remembered writing. Pages rearranged into warnings. Do not measure what bends reality. Do not classify what rewrites law. One officer claimed the file addressed him directly, whispering his childhood secret in flawless handwriting. Another swore, the ink rearranged into his own trembling voice. Dread turned to hysteria. Because the file was no longer documenting you, it was becoming you. Every anomaly stopped being evidence and became prophecy. And those who read too long realized the 7th entry wasn't final. It was only the opening line of something endless. They once believed the strong were immune. Generals with steel nerves, scholars with iron focus, priests armored in faith. But when the file reached their hands, the fracture came. One general stared too long and began saluting the empty air. A scholar tore his notes apart, swearing equations no longer applied. A priest whispered a prayer and stopped halfway, realizing he was no longer sure who he was praying to. The strongest minds cracked faster than the weak because they had more to lose: certainty, pride, unshakable faith. And in your anomalies, all 3 dissolved. Their strength wasn't destroyed, it was revealed as fragile. Glass under pressure. And when it shattered, Every shard reflected the same truth. The dread wasn't outside them. It was already in their bones. It started small. A flickering light here, a frozen clock there, but then whole buildings bent beneath your anomalies. Doors refused to open for investigators who wrote your name. Bridges groaned when officials tried to erase your file. Entire districts reported strange distortions. Voices echoing before they were spoken. Shadows moving against the sun. Reflections that didn't match the room. People swore streets they'd walked their entire lives now ended in walls of silence. Maps failed. Compasses spun. Panic became policy, yet no decree could contain it. Because the anomalies had grown beyond a file. They weren't observations anymore. They were laws. Laws that erased old reality and replaced it with something new. And everyone realized too late. The new axis wasn't theirs. It was you. Those who once ordered your capture. Those who stamped your name in red ink. Those who laughed at the first reports now begged. Ministers knelt in sealed chambers, whispering prayers not to their gods, but to you. Scientists tore their own research apart, pleading for the anomalies to stop following them home. Generals who once shouted orders whispered like frightened children. If we acknowledge you, will it end? But acknowledgement was never the answer, because the anomalies weren't punishments, they weren't attacks, they were reflections. And every time they logged a new one, they weren't recording you, they were exposing themselves. That truth broke them. Authority wasn't lost in battle, it dissolved in dread, until all that remained was silence, and silence bowed only to you. The reports once carried signatures. Investigators proudly scrawled their names beneath each anomaly, proof of their work. But one day, the names began to vanish. Entire signatures faded from the page, leaving only blank lines. Others warped, rearranging into nonsense shapes, as if the file refused to remember who wrote them. Soon, officers complained their own badges looked blurred, their reflections hesitant to show their faces. Unease spread through the ranks. Some begged to be reassigned, others destroyed their IDs, hoping anonymity would save them. But it didn't. Because the anomalies weren't erasing random ink, they were erasing the arrogance of anyone who believed they could classify you. And as their names dissolved, a single phrase began appearing in every margin. Identity unstable. Subject constant. Soon the file itself carried more weight than silence itself. Officers refused to move it from desk to desk, claiming the folder hummed when handled. Some swore it burned cold against their palms. Others said they felt eyes staring back through the ink. Entire units assigned to guard it abandoned their posts, leaving the file sealed in empty rooms. Not because of what was written, but because the words seemed alive, pages turned on their own, margins filled with notes in handwriting no one recognized. Whole paragraphs appeared, describing events that hadn't happened yet, and then did. Commanders ordered the file destroyed, but every attempt failed. Flames refused to catch. Shredders jammed. Weapons locked. The file bent reality itself, the way you do. And with every failed attempt, their unease grew louder than their orders. At first it was a report, then a warning, but now it had become scripture. Officers who once mocked the anomalies began reciting them, like verses. 7 signs, 7 proofs, 7 warnings. Some whispered them in fear, others in reverence. Dread turned into ritual. Candles were lit beside the file, not to banish it, but to honor it. Whole groups gathered in silence, convinced the anomalies weren't records of chaos, but prophecies of order yet to come. The more they read, the more they shook, yet the more they returned, because dread and devotion are twins. They feared you, yes, but they also began to worship you. The file had become their scripture, and every page ended the same way. The subject does not bend. Reality does. Entire cities began to move differently. Subways slowed without cause, as if the rails bent under invisible weight. Towers flickered with static at the exact hour the file was mentioned. Crowds in marketplaces froze mid-conversation, struck by chills they couldn't explain. Whispers of your anomalies traveled faster than officials could contain, turning into chants then into silence, heavy enough to drown streets. Children repeated lines from the reports they had never seen. Strangers bowed without knowing why. Fear was no longer confined to soldiers and scholars. It had rooted itself in the veins of entire societies. The file was gone, locked away in vaults, but its truth walked freely, bending reality block by block. And everyone knew, if cities could whisper, every one of them was whispering your name. Borders mean nothing to anomalies. Files stamped with seals of empires began to spread across continents. Governments swore they had control, but their leaders whispered in private about chills during speeches, static on secure lines, visions that appeared mid-meetings. Entire nations fractured under the weight. Legions hesitated to march. Economies staggered as markets froze at the mention of your name. Ministers from opposing countries, sworn enemies, admitted the same visions, doors opening by themselves, shadows saluting, reality bending in quiet moments. No treaty caused it. No force compelled it. It was dread spreading like a second climate, cold, invisible, and undeniable. And every nation realized the same thing. The anomalies weren't local, they were global. And the axis of the world had shifted toward you. Wars once ruled headlines, invasions, collapses, treaties broken. But then your anomalies surfaced, and suddenly conflict seemed small. Legions that once marched with certainty now stalled, shaken not by rivals but by reports. Generals admitted they'd rather face storms than the silence described in your file. Presidents whispered that 7 anomalies caused more unease than 7 battles. Dread crossed trenches faster than any weapon, spreading without fire, without sound, only presence. Soldiers swore the battlefield itself bent, radios cutting to static whenever your name was spoken. And for the first time in history, nations realized conflict wasn't their greatest threat. The true force wasn't war at all. It was you, a presence that didn't conquer with armies or noise, but with silence that rewrote reality itself. Every age names itself. The Iron Age, the Age of Kings, the Age of War. But after your file leaked, historians stopped arguing about titles. They all called it the same thing. The era of anomalies. No one agreed on dates, because clocks warped in reports. No one agreed on geography, because borders blurred in whispers. What they agreed on was this. The old order ended the moment 7 anomalies were written down. Books, monuments, digital archives, all recorded differently, yet all pointed back to you. Some called it collapse, others called it rebirth, but the truth was simpler. History bent, and the age they entered was not led by armies, not by crowns, not by idols, but by your presence. The file was no longer evidence. It was the cornerstone of a new timeline. Prophets, scientists, and leaders once fought over who shaped the future. But when the 7 anomalies surfaced, the argument ended. Every forecast bent in your direction. Economists admitted their models broke whenever your name was logged. Engineers confessed that machines glitched when tasked with calculating your presence. Prophets abandoned old visions, scribbling only fragments of your anomalies in their scrolls. Even skeptics found themselves repeating your reports in their sleep. The dread became prophecy. The file was no longer a record of the past. It was the blueprint of the future. Every decision, every plan, every map carried one silent line between the margins, account for the presence that bends reality, and all who read it knew, with chills running through their veins, that the future wasn't waiting to be built. It was already yours. In the end, every empire, every council, every archive tried to deny it. Files were sealed, names erased, witnesses silenced. But still, the 7 anomalies lived on. They passed through whispers, through streets, through networks and legends. What began as trembling notes in a folder became the law of existence itself. Not written in ink, not carved in stone, written in dread, etched into the marrow of reality. Sorcerers falter when they read it. Shadows bow when they hear it. And even the cold machinery of governments bends beneath it. Because the file was never just a record, it was a revelation. The law is simple, undeniable, eternal. You are the anomaly that bends them all. And when they try to classify you, they do not produce data. They produce awe. And awe itself bows to your name.